the mic working? Okay. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So reads the first of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. Because ours is a very non-creedal religion, most of us don't put much focus on our 7 principles. From conversations that I've had over the years, I'm pretty sure that most of us could not list them all. I think most can bring 1 or 2 to mind, usually the first and the 7th. But they're really not very central in my experience. So this isn't meant to be an adult education class, but I do want to take a minute to do a quick review of the principles, because I want to bring out a way in which I believe that the first principle is different than the others. So I'm going to read them, and as I read them, listen to how each one sounds more than to what each one might mean. Do some of them sound more formal or even legalistic than others? So here we go. We affirm and promote: 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. 6, the goal of world community with peace, justice, and liberty for all. And 7, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. I believe that every one of these principles is hugely important. Each one contains a hard-won and inspiring insight worthy of study and deep reflection. But we tend to take them for granted, I suppose for the same reason that most of us take having enough to eat and having clean water for granted. Although these principles are far from perfectly realized in our own society, and they are almost completely absent in realization in many cultures and societies around the world, still, they seem to us self-evident, so we tend not to think about them very much. I rarely hear them mentioned in casual conversation among UUs or even in sermons. So today I'm going to offer perhaps a small corrective to this tendency to ignore the 7 principles by focusing on the first one. We affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I'm doing this not because it's first on the list, but because it stands out for me as being somehow different from the others. But before getting into that difference, and why I think it's important, a little UU history provides some important background. Unitarian Universalism was born in 1961 in a merger between 2 liberal Christian denominations, Unitarians and Universalists. Out of that union was born an earlier version of the principles than the version that we have today. And although both denominations had Christian roots going back hundreds of years and more, they both had struggled in their recent history with the problem of defining core beliefs. Both were caught in what I think of as the paradox of liberal inclusion, by which I mean that as religious liberals, our impulse is to include more and more with hearts and minds wide open, and that's a good thing. But this inclusive impulse is in conflict with the need to define core beliefs. So the struggle to define core UU beliefs continued off and on for many years after the 1961 merger, at times with a contentiousness and even bitterness that threatened the very existence of this denomination. There's some very interesting history here, but for my theme today, I want to call your attention to just one general point about that history, or how these principles came to be. And that is that the text of these 7 principles is the result of many, many hours of debate and revision over a span of about 25 years. They were written by committee. And with the possible exception of the King James Bible, that usually doesn't turn out very well. The current version was approved at the 1985 General Assembly in Atlanta and represents a compromise among the 3 main orientations in our denomination: humanist, theist, and earth nature. Notice I did not include Christian in the list. There are Christian UUs among us, myself included, but we are a very tiny minority, but still welcome. Unitarian Universalism gradually ceased to be a Christian denomination in the 1960s and 70s, and that really was crystallized in these 1985 principles that we have today. So back to the first principle. It's my focus today because I have always found it to be the most intuitively compelling and also the hardest to understand. The most intuitively compelling and the hardest to understand. My main interest today is in exploring the compelling part, but first let's look at the hardest to understand part. More so than any of the other 6 principles, it's not really clear what inherent worth and dignity means. In preparation for this sermon, I've read a number of UU sermons. You can, of course, get them online now, and articles that attest to the difficulty of interpreting this principle. I'm certainly not the first one to speak to this theme. The most well-known of these articles is probably the one by Reverend William Schulz in a 2006 UU World article titled, "What Torture Has Taught Me." Reverend Schulz is a very high-profile UU minister. He served as president of the UUA from 1985 to 93 and director of Amnesty International USA from 1994 to 2006. And he's also a very powerful and wonderful speaker, as anyone who has heard him will attest. In his 2006 article, he writes very movingly about how his direct confrontation with both the perpetrators and victims of torture changed his perspective on inherent worth and dignity. In brief, he no longer believes in it, or at least he didn't when he wrote the article. He no longer affirms and promotes that people who commit monstrous crimes have inherent worth and dignity. You really need to read his article to get a fuller appreciation of his experience and thinking. But this and all the articles and sermons that I've read wrestle with this problem of evil in relation to our first principle. They all mention Schulz's article at some point and attempt to provide a rational interpretation that stands up to his disillusioned criticism. So the idea of inherent worth is a hard problem that all UUs should spend some time thinking about. Reconciling it with the brute fact of profoundly evil people is just one of the problems. There are others. For example, what exactly does it mean for a quality to be inherent? I've been practicing Buddhist meditation for many years now, and to some degree at least I've absorbed a Buddhist understanding or perspective on things. And from that perspective, there's no such thing as inherency, simply because everything is changing all the time, all the way up, all the way down, all the way in, and all the way out. There are no inherent qualities because there is nothing consistent for anything to adhere into. This might sound a little esoteric, but one aspect of this is Buddhist insight that there is no self to be found in actual experience. Try it. You won't find it anywhere. The same insight on a more intellectual level can be found in ancient Greek philosophy and in modern science. Another hard question asks whether an embryo at conception has inherent worth. If we say yes, maybe this principle calls us to deny a woman's right to end her pregnancy. If we say no, then when exactly does a developing embryo actually get this inherent worth thing? And what exactly does having inherent worth entitle us to? Can we lose it? If so, how? Can we have it different amounts of it at different times of the day? Maybe varying with our mood or what we've done that day, whether we've been good or bad. If we lose it, can we get it back? And by the way, is there any real difference between worth and dignity? Can we have one without the other? So we can ask lots of questions like these, all of which drive home the point that it's really hard to make any practical sense out of the first principle, out of inherent worth and dignity. Yet, in spite of these intellectual problems, I've always found the first principle strangely compelling. And this, thinking about this really goes back maybe about 10 years for me. That's when I remember first starting to think about this. So what I mean here is that more than the other principles, it manages to resonate for me at a level that is beyond the intellect alone, beyond what is explicitly said. And this, perhaps surprisingly, is its key strength. I believe that much more so than the other principles, the first principle functions as religious language. By religious language, I mean language whose primary function is to call forth a life-affirming but non-intellectual response. True religious language should never be taken literally. In fact, the literal meaning just gets in the way. In this regard, it is like poetry, but it is the poetry of ultimate concerns, to use the expression of the theologian Paul Tillich, ultimate concerns. Religious poetic language has this quality of calling forth from us something deeper than the literal meaning can convey. And that's why I think the first principle, calling us to see the inherent worth and dignity of all persons, stands out. In spite of having been created in committee and subjected to endless rounds of critique, it managed to retain a certain suggestive power. It helps that this is the only one of the 7 principles that actually sounds kind of poetic. It has, if you chop it a little bit, the front and the back, it has 5 iambic beats, just like Shakespeare. Affirm, inherent worth, and dignity. It sounds nice. So this kind of language invites us to dig for meaning, and I've been doing that recently. And I've come up with 3 ways of understanding the principle. They're, in a way, all the same, but just with slightly different emphasis, or maybe one goes a little deeper than the next. So here's what I've come up with. The first and most obvious meaning, right on the surface, is a call to non-prejudicial seeing. Every person deserves to be seen for what they are rather than what we might assume them to be based on what we have been taught or learned beforehand. In Buddhism, this is called direct seeing, or beginner's mind, to use the expression of Shinryo Suzuki, a revered Buddhist teacher from the 60s. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the experts, there are few." Now, I happen to make my living as a technician, as a technical expert, so I could maybe argue with that a little bit, but I won't, because really, the point, this was Suzuki's Zen way of calling us to really look with fresh eyes at what is happening, not to allow past conditioning to cut ourselves off from current possibilities. From that perspective, to say that a person deserves to be really seen is not quite on point. It is better to say that it is skillful to do this, which is another Buddhist way of putting it. This direct seeing is much harder to do than it sounds, and I doubt that anyone, even saints and Buddhas, ever really achieves perfection at it, because it's really hard. But to the extent that we fail to do this, we lead impoverished lives. To the extent that we fail to do it, we are a danger to ourselves and others, like driving down Lincoln Drive with our eyes closed. This does not mean that what we see in a given person or situation is necessarily good. It doesn't mean that at all. Maybe what we see tells us that we need to intervene to stop some harmful behavior. But our practice, rooted in the first principle, is to do our very best to really, really look and act appropriately. Here's another take or aspect on the first principle. Contemporary Buddhist teacher John Tarrant says, "Attention is the most basic form of love. Through it we bless and are blessed." Attention is the most basic form of love. This is still using the Buddhist emphasis on attention, or mindfulness, to use the current popular term. But now we are into a more religious space in the sense that regardless of the outcome, we are called to relate to people as ends in themselves rather than means to our own ends. And this calls us to see people not just for what they are or what they say they are, but for what they may be trying to become or trying to express. We can look to what they could become or how they could be blessed, how they could bless and be blessed. This requires deep listening, hearing what is not or cannot be said directly, maybe even what is not yet made conscious. With this emphasis on seeing hidden goodness, poet Galway Kinnell, in his poem St. Francis and the Sow, puts it like this. This is a short excerpt from a longer poem. "The bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers from within of self-blessing, though sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on its brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch, it is lovely, until it flowers again from within of self-blessing." Isn't that a wonderful vision, that we can call forth a thing, a person, to self-blessing? Ideally, this is what teachers do, and blessed be they, because it's not easy. I want to return for a minute to the article by Reverend Schultz that I mentioned earlier. I am very sympathetic to his struggle to reconcile inherent worth and dignity with his direct experience of evil in refugee camps around the world. But at one point in the article, I think he dismisses a very important suggestion much too quickly. After wrestling with and rejecting several possible understandings of inherent worth and dignity, he says, "I suspect that we base our belief in the inherent worth of human beings on some vague notion that aliveness itself is good, and that because human beings represent the pinnacle of aliveness, we inherently possess some kind of merit. I don't buy that anymore." End quote. Well, I also don't buy the idea that we represent some kind of pinnacle of aliveness. If anything, the opposite seems true in many ways. But I do think that our inherent worth and dignity principle is suggestive of the magnificent, improbably intricate aliveness and potential of each and every human being, including those who commit evil deeds. They must be confronted. We cannot escape the problem of evil in thinking about or acting through the first principle. But evil does not negate what the principle is really about. Rightly understood, it does not suggest, for example, that Dylan Roof should not be imprisoned for life. I don't even think it says one way or the other whether he should receive the death penalty. But it does call us to relate to evildoers as miraculously alive, even in their deranged state, once we have taken care of the messy and painful business of restraining them from doing further harm. This is no easy task, either the restraining part or the relating part. A spiritually animated life is not an easy one. I have one more perspective or take on the first principle that I want to offer you, and I think it is the deepest of all. This one I learned recently from the great 20th century religious thinker Martin Buber. His most widely known book is titled I and Thou. It's not an easy read. It's full of passages like this. Primary words do not describe something that might exist independently of them, but being spoken, they bring about existence. Primary words are spoken from the being. What in the world is he talking about? I thought the first few times that I tried to read Buber. To really get his meaning requires some close reading and deep reflection. It's something I'm still working on. But let me try at least to convey what I think is his main and most important teaching for us here today. Quite simply, Buber teaches that relationship, or more precisely dialogue, is the pathway to the most fully realized life. All real living is meeting, teaches Buber. All real living is meeting. He says that there are two fundamental attitudes or ways of being in the world. One he calls I-it, I-it. When we are in the I-it attitude, we relate to other living beings as objects in the world, as things to be understood, manipulated, explained, enjoyed, denounced, etc. This is not a bad thing. We need it to survive. Of necessity, we all spend most of our lives in this I-it attitude, and Buber was no different from the rest of us in this regard. The other attitude he calls I-thou, I-thou in the writing. And it's much harder to explain, but it is his term for those moments when we are fully present to another person and they are fully present to us. Fully present means fully and exclusively engaged in the encounter or dialogue without self-consciousness and without an agenda. This is beyond liking and not liking. It's beyond emotion even. He's not talking about a relationship necessarily with a loved one. It's also beyond making the other person or ourselves better or worse, although it doesn't exclude that. Language is our human birthright, and through this gift, we can sometimes drop into a transcendent state with another being, he teaches. To me, this is a lot like what Buddhism teaches, but with the very important difference that it is rooted in relationship, primarily with other humans through language, but in a more limited way, even with animals and what he calls spirit beings. Buber definitely does not endorse the ideal of an isolated, enlightened being sitting on a mountaintop or in a remote cave, an image that can be found in Buddhism. For Buber, in Buddhism. For Buber, it's all about having as much I-thou in our lives as we can manage, while knowing that we will mostly have I-it. Buber himself, by the way, was a highly accomplished scholar who must have spent a great deal of his time alone with his books. But about that, he once said, "I do indeed close my door at times and surrender myself to a book, but only because I can open the door again and see a human face looking at me." And by the way, I also want to mention, in case Buber sounds like someone who was unacquainted with the real world, he was a Jew who lived most of his life in the 20th century, so he knew all about it. There is much more to Buber's philosophy than just this, but this is the main idea as best I can summarize it. And I do believe it takes us to the deepest level of understanding inherent worth and dignity. All people, including evildoers, present the potential for an I-thou encounter through which we can have the fullest experience of our humanity and even glimpse the divine. This is not so mystical as it might first seem. I believe that we all have experienced I-thou moments. Buber's genius was to describe them in a very poetic, philosophical way and call our attention to their importance. So I'd like to leave you with a final observation. With this focus on relationship brought out in the first principle, we can look over the other 6 UU principles and see that, in fact, they are all about relationship, about right relationship with other people, or in the case of the 7th principle, with nature, broadly considered. Each one calls out a different aspect or level, and they are all important and worthy of reflection. You might say we make a religion of being in right relationship with others. So the people who spent all those hours in committee meetings working up our 7 principles did a good job for which we owe a debt of gratitude. But it's the first principle that really sets a spiritual tone and provides the best way of understanding all the others. If we take inherent worth to heart and put it into practice, our lives and our world will be greatly enriched. So may it be for me and for each and every one of you here today. Blessings to you all. Amen.